"I don't think we're meant to be here," Edmund said, and I heard the whole of him fold into those 6 words. We were at the back, past the cordon, past the rope, past the gravel apron where the chairs ran out, and the crowd became a wall of coats and lifted phones. I had pushed his chair as far as the break of bodies would let me, and that was to a strip of churned grass at the very edge of the forecourt of Thornmere House, where the wind came around the corner of the east wing like it had a grievance. From there, you could see the ceremony the way you see weather on a far hill, the colors moving. The band, thin to a brass mutter by the distance. A great deal of red along the front rank, where the guardsmen stood, and behind them the gilded rail, and behind that the steps where the honors would be given. Edmund had served 11 years on those steps, and here we were, behind everyone, with his medals in a small box on his knee, because the lapel of his coat had no strength left to pin them to, and a paper card in my pocket that said, in a careful hand, "Reserved seating, veterans," with a number on it that meant nothing now because the seats it referred to were 100 feet away and full of strangers. He wasn't bitter. That was the part that pulled at me. A bitter man would have been easier. Edmund just got quiet, the way he got quiet about most of the things age had taken, and he looked at his hands, and he said it again, softer, so I'd think he was only thinking aloud and wouldn't fuss. "I don't think we're meant to be here." "You're meant to be here more than anyone," I said. "Give me a minute." I am his carer. I should say that plainly, because it explains why I noticed and why I would not let it go. My name is Marin Selby, and 3 mornings a week in most ceremony days, I am the one who gets Edmund Vance up and dressed and out the door, and I am the one who reads the small print he stopped being able to read, and I am the one who knows that he had not slept the night before because of this, not from nerves, from hope. He had ironed the coat himself. He had got me to polish the metals he could no longer feel the weight of, and he had practiced, in the hallway of his flat, the small straight set of the shoulders he wanted to manage when his name was read. He is 81. The chair is new this year. The hope was old. So I went looking for someone to fix it, and I learned in about 4 minutes that no one was going to. The first steward I found was young and harassed and kind, and he looked at the card and looked at the seating and said the seats had been reallocated for capacity, and that the reserved block had filled before the gates were properly managed, and he was sorry, nothing he could do from where he stood. The second one was older and not kind, and he said the cordon was the cordon and everyone behind it was behind it for a reason, and would I please keep the chair off the grass margin. It churned. The third didn't stop walking. By the time I came back to Edmund, I had the particular hot feeling behind the eyes that I get when I have failed someone I love at a small thing that is not small at all, and he saw it on me before I'd said a word, and he reached up and patted my arm. "It's all right, Marin," he said. "I've seen it, I came, that's the thing, I came." It was not all right, but you cannot argue a man out of his own grace. And that should have been the end of it, the 2 of us at the cold edge of a forecourt, watching honor happen to other people from 100 feet back. Except that I had been so busy hunting stewards that I hadn't noticed we'd come to rest beside the very end of the front cordon, where it turned the corner of the east wing, and where one guardsman stood his post. He was the last man on the line. Red tunic, the tall black bearskin, white gloves, the rifle at his side, the chin strap cutting a pale line on a face that did not move at all. He was perhaps 15 feet from us, just inside the rope, facing out across the crowd with the flat forward stare they all have, the stare that goes through you and past you and lands on nothing. I'd seen 100 of them on 100 ceremony days. They are scenery. They are the handsome stillness in the photographs. I did not expect anything from him, and I would have told you if you'd asked, that expecting anything from one of them was like expecting the gilded rail to lean down and help you. I was wrong about him in a way I am still, weeks later, not finished being moved by. Because Edmund, who had not raised his voice once in the whole sorry business, who had folded himself down small so as not to be trouble, Edmund did a thing then that I think he did without deciding to. He squared his shoulders. There, at the back, with no one to see, with the wind off the east wing pulling at the blanket on his knees. The old man set his shoulders the way he'd practiced in his hallway, and he lifted his chin, and he looked toward the colors with the bearing of a man on parade. He gave the ceremony the respect it would not give him. It was the saddest, straightest thing I have ever watched a person do. And the guardsman's eyes moved. I want to be exact about this because I have gone over it many times. He did not turn his head. He did not break. The discipline held the way a frozen river holds. You'd swear it was solid until you saw the dark line of water moving underneath. His eyes came off the middle distance and found the old man in the chair at the edge of the grass, just for a moment. And I watched something cross behind that flat forward stare, recognition, I would call it, though Edmund had never in his life set eyes on this young man. Recognition of the bearing. Recognition of what that set of the shoulders cost and what it meant and where it had been learned. The guardsman saw in the man everyone else had pushed to the margin, one of his own. Then the eyes went forward again, and the face was scenery again, and I thought I had imagined it. I had not imagined it. He had simply gone to work. I didn't know yet that a man on that line cannot leave it, that the post is a kind of vow, that he had no more freedom to walk over to us than the rail did. I didn't know that what looked like indifference was a man held in iron by an oath, working out, behind a still face, how to do a thing he was forbidden to do directly. I only knew that the wind was cruel and the band was far away, and that my Edmund had come to be honored and was instead being weathered at the back, like a thing left out. Marin, Edmund said. He'd seen the eyes move too. The old soldier in him had read it before I had. That lad, he clocked me. He did, I said. They're not supposed to look, Edmund said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard all morning. Not hope exactly. The memory of hope. 11 years I never once let my eyes go off the front, not for the king himself. Then why did he? I asked. Edmund didn't answer me. He was watching the line. And out at the corner of the east wing, the last guardsman on the cordon brought his rifle up into a slow, deliberate, perfect movement that was not part of any ceremony I could see. And somewhere down the red line, another head began, very slightly, to turn. I have since had the whole of it explained to me, by people who would know, and so I can tell you what I could only feel at the time, that the guardsman was not free to come to us, but he was not without recourse either. A man on a ceremonial line has a vocabulary that has nothing to do with words. The set of the rifle, the angle of a movement, a thing done a half-second off the rhythm everyone else is keeping. These are seen, down the line and behind it, by the men whose entire training is to see them. The young guardsman could not leave his post to fetch a chair through a crowd. What he could do was raise a flag that only his own kind could read, and he raised it. The movement of the rifle drew the eye of the next man along, who did not turn his head but whose gaze, I am told, slid sideways the way a careful man checks a mirror. That man, reading the angle, did the same small wrong rhythm thing, passing it on, so that within perhaps 20 seconds a ripple I never properly saw had run down the inside of the cordon and reached, at the far corner near the steps, a figure who was not a wall of red but a single man in a slightly different coat, an officer, or what passed for one, standing a half-pace back from the line with his hands folded, watching the watchers. He was watching for exactly this. That is what a man in that position is for. The line holds the ground. He holds the line, and when the line tells him, in its silent grammar, that something at the edge of the field needs a decision made by someone allowed to make decisions, he goes and finds out what it is. I did not know any of that. What I saw was a tall man in a dark coat with a single line of braid at the cuff detach himself from the foot of the steps and begin to come down the inside of the cordon, unhurried, hands behind his back, the walk of a man who is nowhere he is not allowed to be, until he reached the corner of the east wing where the last guardsman stood, and stopped, and stood beside him, and looked out across the rope at exactly the patch of churned grass where I had parked my Edmund. The guardsman did not speak. I want to be clear about that because I had assumed, watching, that he would lean and murmur and explain. He didn't. He never once turned his head or moved his lips. He simply, while looking straight ahead, brought two white-gloved fingers a few degrees toward the chair, a movement smaller than a wave, smaller than a nod, a movement you would have to be looking for to see, and then was perfectly still again, a statue who had just pointed without pointing. The officer followed the line of it. His eyes found Edmund, and I watched the officer take in about the same 2 seconds the guardsman had needed, the same set of things. The medals in the little box on the old knees, the bearing the old man was still holding against the wind, the chair, the cold, the back of the crowd. He took it in, and his jaw set, and he turned and looked back up the long forecourt toward the front rows where the reserved block sat full of the wrong people. And I saw the precise moment a decision arrived in a man who was allowed to make them. He came to the rope. He did not step over it. Even he, I would learn, observed the rope. But he came right up to it and spoke to me across it, quietly, with the particular courtesy of a man embarrassed on someone else's behalf. "Madam, is this gentleman a veteran of the regiment?" "He served 11 years, I said. "On the honor steps, he's 81. We had reserved seating and it was given away." My voice came out harder than I meant. "3 of your stewards told me there was nothing to be done." "They were mistaken," the officer said, and that was all the apology he made, and it was enough because of how he said it. He looked at Edmund directly then over the rope, and his voice changed, not softer but more formal, the way you speak to a man whose rank you have just remembered. "Sir, forgive the wait. Will you allow us to bring you forward?" And Edmund, who had told me an hour of refusals ago that it was all right, that he had come, that coming was the thing. Edmund looked up at this officer he had never met, and his mouth worked, and for a moment the grace he had been holding all morning cracked clean down the middle, and I saw under it the man who had not slept, who had ironed the coat, who had practiced in his hallway. "I'd be honored," Edmund said, in a voice that was not steady at all. The officer straightened and turned and lifted one hand to the line, and the rope at the corner of the east wing came down. I cannot tell you how strange it is to watch a cordon open. It is the most fixed thing at one of these events. The whole crowd organizes itself around the certainty that the rope does not move. And then a guardsman unclipped one end of it and drew it back, smooth as a curtain, and a gap appeared in the wall of red that the whole forecourt had been arranged against, and the gap was for us. "This way, madam," the officer said. "Mind the gravel." I got behind the chair. My hands were not steady either, and as I turned Edmund to push him through the gap in the line, the last guardsman on the cordon, the young one, the one who had started all of it, who still had not moved a muscle of his face, did one more thing I will carry the rest of my life. As the old man's chair drew level with him, the guardsman, eyes forward, statue, still, brought his white-gloved hand up off the rifle and held it, for the length of a breath, flat against the seam of his trouser, and then he raised it, slow and exact, to the brim of the bearskin, and held the salute to a stranger in a wheelchair at the edge of a crowd, while the band played somewhere far ahead, and no one in front had any idea it was happening. Edmund saw it, of course he saw it. "Eyes front, son," the old man murmured, so quietly I think I was the only other person who heard. It was the kindest order I've ever heard given. The guardsman's hand came down, his face never changed, and we went forward into the open lane the line had made for us. The crowd is the part I wasn't ready for. When you go from the back of a thing to the front of it, you don't just change your view. You change what you are in everyone's eyes. We had spent the morning being an obstacle, a chair to be steered around, a margin to be kept off the grass, and now we were moving up the inside of the cordon with an officer ahead of us clearing the way, and 1,000 faces turned, in that slow ripple a crowd makes, to see who was important enough to be brought forward. I felt the wrongness of it before Edmund did. People assumed. I saw it move across the faces nearest the rope. This old man being escorted to the front, this must be someone, a dignitary, a person of consequence, somebody whose name they ought to know. A woman near the front lifted her phone and then, uncertain, lowered it again, not sure whether she was allowed to film whatever this was. And Edmund, who had hidden his medals in a box because his coat had no strength to wear them, took the box up off his knee as we moved and opened it, and with the careful, slow, ruined hands that could no longer feel the weight of them, began to pin them on. One at a time. He couldn't manage the clasps. I leaned down to help and he said, not unkindly, "I'll do it, Marin," and I understood that this, too, was something he needed to do himself, in front of all of them slowly, while the whole forecourt watched a man find his place. So I walked slow and let him. It took the length of the entire forecourt. By the time we reached the front he had got 3 of the 4 pinned, crooked, and the 4th he held in his closed fist, because the clasp had beaten him, and he held it the way you hold a thing you have decided to be buried with. The reserved block, when we reached it, was a problem, and I watched the officer solve it the way he had solved the rope. There were no empty seats. That was the truth of it. The front rows were full, every chair taken by people who had got there early and sat down and were not, by any law of crowds, going to give one up for an old man they didn't know. But the officer did not ask anyone to give up a seat. He had a better idea, and it was the idea that turned the whole morning for me from a rescue into something larger. He did not put Edmund in the block of veteran seating at all. He took the chair past it. "Sir," he said to Edmund, walking beside the chair now, "the honors are given from the steps. The men who served are seated to the side, as you know, but the steps themselves are kept clear for the colors and the party. I'd like to put you at the foot of them, front and center, where the line can see you." He paused. "If you're willing to be seen." I felt Edmund go still under my hands. I think he understood the offer before I did. To be seated with the other veterans would have been a kindness, a chair, a place, an end to the cold. But to be set at the foot of the honors steps, alone in front of everyone, facing the colors, where every guardsman on the line would have him in their forward stare for the whole of the ceremony, that was not a kindness. That was a post. The officer was not finding Edmund a seat. He was giving an old soldier back his station. "I served on those steps," Edmund said. 11 years. "I know, sir," the officer said. "That's why I'm asking." "How do you know?" Edmund said. He turned in the chair to look up at the man. "I never gave you my name." The officer looked, for the first time, almost young. "The man on the corner of the east wing told me," he said. "He never spoke a word," I said. "I was watching, he never opened his mouth." "No, madam," the officer agreed. "He didn't. Didn't have to. The way that gentleman set his shoulders back there at the edge in the cold with no one watching." He nodded toward Edmund, and something moved in the officer's own face, quickly mastered. "There's only one place a man learns to stand like that. My guardsman saw it from 40 feet. He told me everything I needed to know without turning his head. That's the whole of our trade, sir, to say the necessary thing while appearing to say nothing at all. You taught it to someone once, I'd wager." "He just taught it back to you." Edmund didn't answer. He had begun to cry, the slow, undramatic way, the very old cry, water gathering and going over without any change in the face, and I do not think he knew he was doing it. He had spent the morning being graceful about being forgotten. He had no defenses ready for being remembered. They set him at the foot of the steps. I want to describe it properly, because it is the image I will keep. The steps of Thornmere House are broad pale stone, and they rise to the gilded rail and the doors of the east wing where the honors party would emerge, and they had been kept clear all morning, a clean swept space at the very heart of the ceremony that the whole forecourt faced. And into the bottom of that clear space, dead center, framed by the steps rising behind him and the colors stirring above, they wheeled one old man in a chair with 3 crooked medals pinned to a coat too tired to hold them, and a 4th clutched in his fist. The officer locked the brake himself. He set the chair square, squared it to the colors, the way you'd dress a man on parade, and he stepped back. And for a moment the whole front of the ceremony was just Edmund, alone, facing forward, in the place the morning had spent every effort to keep him out of. And every guardsman on the line, who had been staring at nothing all morning, was now staring at him. A murmur went through the crowd, not unkind, curious, and then, as the medals registered and the chair and the age, something warmer than curious. Somewhere behind me the phones came up again, and this time no one lowered them. And I stood a little to the side, where a carer stands, close enough to come if I was needed and far enough to be out of the photograph, and I watched my Edmund square his shoulders one more time at the foot of the honors steps, in front of God and the colors and 1,000 strangers, and I thought, there he is. That's the man. I thought that was the honor. I thought being seen was the whole of it. I had no idea the ceremony itself was about to find out he was there. The honors are not a small thing at Thornmere House. I had read about them on the card, in the small print Edmund can no longer read, while we waited in the back. The colors brought down the steps, the year's recipients called forward by name, the long roll of the regiment's honored dead read out at the close while the line presents arms. It is the one day a year the steps are used for what they were built for. And it was about to begin, and we were at the foot of it, and I felt the size of where we'd been put settle onto me like a weight. The doors of the east wing opened. The band, which had been a far brass mutter all morning, was suddenly close and enormous, and a party came out onto the top of the steps. Not royalty, I should say. This was not that kind of day, but the keeper of the house and the regiment's senior men, gray-headed and braided and grave, and they came to the head of the steps and stood, and the whole forecourt came to its feet, and the colors were brought down through the middle of them, dipping. And I felt Edmund's hand find my wrist and grip it harder than I thought he had strength for. The officer who had brought us forward had gone up the side of the steps and was standing now near the keeper, and I saw him lean and say something, 3 words, 4, into the ear of an aide, and I saw the message go up the little chain of gray-headed men, the way the signal had gone down the line of red ones quietly, without anyone turning, until it reached the keeper of the house himself. And the keeper looked down the steps and saw the old man in the chair. The ceremony did not stop. I want to be exact because the not stopping was the whole grace of it. A lesser house would have stopped, would have made a production of it, called for quiet, made my Edmund into a spectacle and a speech. The keeper did no such thing. He let the colors finish their descent. He let the band finish its measure. He let the year's recipients be called forward and given their honors, 3 young men and a woman, each crossing the clear space at the foot of the steps to be received, and each of them, I noticed as they came down, glanced at the old man in the chair they had to pass, and each of them, without being told, gave him a small nod, soldier to soldier, before they turned to face the steps. The recognition was spreading on its own now. It had stopped being a thing the officer arranged, and started being a thing the regiment did. Then the recipients stepped back, and the band fell to a low, sustained note, and the keeper of the house came forward to the head of the steps for the reading of the honored dead. This is the part of the ceremony that the cards call the Vigil of Names. The keeper reads the roll, the men of the regiment who have died in the year past, and then, in shorter form, the names that the regiment carries always, the ones it does not let go. The line presents arms. The colors are lowered. It is, by every account I have read since, the most solemn 5 minutes of the Thornmere year, and it is the reason men like Edmund served on these steps in the first place. To stand, 11 years, so that this could happen with the dignity it deserved. The keeper read the year's dead. The line presented arms, and I heard it, the great single clean sound of 100 rifles moving as one, close now, right in front of us. The sound Edmund must have made 10,000 times. And I felt the old man beside me try to do it too. His right hand came up off the wheel of the chair, the fist that held the 4th medal opened, and he laid his ruined hand flat against the rail of the chair and pressed his shoulders back and held himself, at attention, in a wheelchair, at the foot of the steps, while the living line presented arms over his head. And then the keeper, having read the years dead, did the thing the officer's 4 words had asked him to do. He did not break the ceremony. He folded Edmund into it. And we hold always, the keeper read in the old formula, the names of those who kept this ground. He read 4 names, old names, names from before my time and before Edmund's, the regiments carried dead, and then he paused and looked down the steps directly at the old man in the chair, and added in exactly the same cadence, not as an interruption but as though it had always belonged in the roll. And we honor this day those who kept it still living among us, and who are come home to these steps. It was not Edmund's name. The keeper did not say his name. He didn't know it, and to have read out a name he'd been handed 30 seconds before would have been a smaller thing. He did something larger. He made a place in the most sacred passage of the year for the old man who had kept these steps, and he gave the whole forecourt the half-second it needed to understand who he meant. The man in the chair, alone, dead center, at the foot of the steps, with his crooked medals and his soldiers' shoulders. And then he lowered his head, and the colors came down, and the line held the present. I have never heard 1,000 people be so quiet. And into that quiet, Edmund Vance did the last thing his body had been saving itself for all morning. He could not stand. We both knew he could not stand. He had not stood unaided in 2 years. But he put both hands on the arms of the chair and he pushed, and I started forward to stop him from falling. And the officer down the steps in one motion was there before me, and so was one of the young recipients, and between them, with a hand under each of the old man's arms, lightly, the way you steady a thing you respect rather than a thing you pity, they did not lift him. They let him rise. They gave him just enough that his own legs, for the length of the present arms, could do the rest. He stood at the foot of the Thornmere steps, swaying, held, an 81-year-old man on his own feet for the first time in 2 years, and he brought his right hand up, the ruined hand, the one that could not feel the medals, and he held a salute to the lowered colors while the line that he had once stood in held theirs above him. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds. I counted them later, off the footage, because by the end of that week there was footage. A dozen phones had caught it from the front, and one of them put it where everyone could see it, and several million people who were not at Thornmere House that morning have now watched an old man stand who could not stand. But at the time there was no count and no footage and no million people. There was just the band's low note, and the held salute above and below, and the wind that had been cruel all morning dropping, for those 8 seconds, to nothing. And then the band lifted, and the colors came back up, and the line brought their rifles down out of the present, and the officer and the young recipient eased Edmund back into the chair as gently as they had let him rise. He was shaking, not from cold now. I got to him and put my hand on his shoulder and felt the whole of him trembling under the tired coat, and he reached up and held my hand against his shoulder and didn't speak, and I didn't either, because there was nothing I could have added to it. The crowd, when the silence broke, did not cheer. I have thought about that a great deal. A cheer would have been wrong, and they knew it, the way 1,000 people sometimes know a thing all at once. What they did instead was applaud, but slowly, and standing, the kind of applause that is really a long collective exhale, that goes on not because it is loud but because no one wants to be the first to stop. It rolled up the forecourt from the front and broke against the back wall of coats where we had stood an hour before, forgotten, and rolled forward again. Edmund sat in the middle of it with 3 crooked medals and one in his fist, and let it come. When the ceremony closed and the party went back up the steps and the doors of the east wing shut on the colors, the forecourt began to loosen and break apart the way crowds do, and people drifted toward us, not in a crush. The officer saw to that, standing a quiet half-step off the chair like a breakwater, but in ones and twos to shake the old man's hand to thank him, to ask, gently, where he had served. Edmund answered every one of them. He had not the strength to do it, and he did it anyway, because being asked where you served, after a morning of being asked to keep your chair off the grass, is the kind of thing a man finds strength for. A small boy was lifted up by his father to see the medals, and Edmund opened his fist and showed the child the fourth one, the one the clasp had beaten, lying loose in his palm, and told him what it was for in a few quiet words I didn't catch. And the boy nodded the serious way children nod at things they will remember without understanding. But the person I had been waiting for did not come, because the person I had been waiting for could not leave his post. The line had not stood down. The cordon had reformed. The rope was back up at the corner of the east wing, smooth as if it had never opened, and the last guardsman on it stood exactly where he had stood all morning, red and black and white and unmoving, facing out across the emptying forecourt with the flat forward stare, as though none of it had happened, as though he had not started all of it with the movement of a rifle, and ended it with a salute no one in front had seen. Edmund saw me looking at him. "Take me over," he said. So I did. I wheeled him out of the loosening crowd, across the gravel he'd been kept off of all morning, to the corner of the east wing, and stopped the chair a respectful few feet from the rope, in front of the young man who had refused all morning to so much as turn his head, and who did not turn it now. "I won't keep you, son," Edmund said. "I know you can't talk to me. I stood that line. 11 years I never said a word on it, not to my own brother when he came to watch." He paused, and his voice, which had held through the handshakes and the thanks, went rough. "I want to tell you what you did, in case nobody does. You weren't allowed to come to me. So you found the only thing you were allowed to do, and you did it perfectly, and you got every other man on that line to do it with you, and you got an officer to do it, and you got the keeper of the house to do it, and not one of you broke your post to do any of it. You moved the whole of Thornmere House toward an old man at the back without one of you taking a step you weren't allowed to take." He stopped. "That's the finest piece of soldiering I've seen in 40 years, and I served with the finest there were." The guardsman did not move. His eyes stayed forward. His face was scenery. But a single tear came down it, one. It started at the corner of his eye and ran the line the chin strap had cut and reached his jaw and hung there. And he did not blink it away, and he did not wipe it, and he did not break the stare, because he could not, because he was on his post. He simply let it fall and held the line, and I understood, watching it, that this was the most that a man bound by that oath was permitted to give, and that he was giving all of it. "There it is," Edmund said softly, almost to himself. "Eyes front, son, you're all right." And we left him there. We left him standing his post, which is what he wanted, which is the only thing he could have wanted, and we went home. I learned the rest of it slowly, over the weeks after, the way you learn the size of a thing only once it's behind you. The officer wrote to Edmund a proper letter on the regiment's paper, thanking him for his service and apologizing clearly, in plain words, without lawyers hedging, for the failure of the seating, which he called, in writing, a disgrace that should not have required a guardsman's eye to correct, and will not happen again. He enclosed a card with a telephone number on it, and said that any veteran of the regiment who came to a Thornmere ceremony from that day forward would be received at the front gate by name, by a steward briefed to expect them, and seated at the front, and that this had been written into the standing orders for the house, and given a name, because the regiment names the things it means to keep. They called it the Vance Provision after Edmund, though he protested that he'd done nothing, that he'd only sat in a chair in the cold, that the lad on the corner had done it all. That was true, and it wasn't. The guardsman raised the flag, but it took an old soldier squaring his shoulders at the back of a crowd, where no one was watching, refusing to be less than he was even when he had been made small. It took that for there to be a flag worth raising. The young man recognized the bearing because the bearing was real. You cannot signal honor down a line of trained men about a man who isn't carrying any. Edmund earned the salute in the 8 cold seconds before anyone came, by being, at the very back, exactly the man he had been on the steps. I did in time learn who the guardsman was, though I will not put his name here, because he asked me not to, and because a man who would let one tear fall rather than break his post is not a man who wants his name in front of a thing. But I learned why he saw what he saw so fast. He had a grandfather, it turned out, who had served not at Thornmere, somewhere else, a different uniform, a smaller war, and who had spent his last years in a chair, and who had been taken to a parade once, late in his life, and left at the back, and had said almost nothing about it but had never asked to be taken to one again. The young guardsman had been a boy then. He had pushed that chair. He knew exactly what the set of an old man's shoulders meant at the edge of a crowd, because he had seen it once before and had been too young and too small to fix it, and had carried that smallness, I think, into the line. And on the morning he finally stood where he could do something about it, he was forbidden by his oath to move, and he found a way to move the whole house instead without taking a step. That is the thing I keep coming back to. We think of those men as the opposite of helpful, the famous stillness, the won't react, the statues who let tourists shout in their faces and never blink. And so they are on the surface, and it is the discipline of it that we photograph. But the stillness is not emptiness. The stillness is a held charge. The whole of that training, all those hours of standing through cold and rudeness and the wind off the east wing, is not so the man will feel nothing. It is so that when the moment comes that genuinely requires him, not a tourist's taunt, but a real wrong, an old soldier dying of cold and neglect at the back of his own honor, he will have the iron to act inside the rules instead of breaking them, and the rules, used like that, by a man who has made himself strong enough to obey them even then, turn out to bend the whole world toward mercy without anyone leaving their post. Edmund lived another year and a bit. He went back to Thornmere the next founding day, and they received him at the gate by name, and seated him at the front, and he wore all 4 medals because the officer had sent, with the letter, a small thing, a length of regimental ribbon and a backing bar. So the 4th medal that had beaten his hands would stay pinned without a clasp he couldn't work. He sat at the front that 2nd year and was honored as a matter of course, with no rescue required, and he told me afterward that it had been a fine day and a proper one, and I could see that it had, and I was glad of it. But it was the 1st year he talked about to the end, the cold one, the one where they put him at the back. He told it in his last months, not as the story of a wrong, though it was one, but as the story of a young man who could not turn his head and turned a whole house instead. I was at the back, he'd begin, every time to whoever would listen, his nurses and his old friends, and once, near the end, to the chaplain. And I'd given up. Marin had given up too, though she'd never say it, and there was this lad on the corner of the east wing. And he'd tell it, and his hands would lift a little off the blanket, trying to show the set of the shoulders, the angle of the rifle, the half-degree of 2 gloved fingers, the salute. He never could quite show it. You'd have had to be there. I was there. That is why I have written it down. When he died, the regiment sent a man to the funeral, a guardsman, in the red and the bearskin, who stood at the back of the small chapel through the whole service, motionless, the way they do. I did not arrange it, and I do not know who did, the officer perhaps, and I will be honest and tell you I cannot say for certain that it was the same young man from the corner of the east wing. The bearskin sits low, the chin strap cuts the same pale line on every face. From the front of a chapel they are all deliberately the same man. I like to think it was him, but it doesn't finally matter whether it was, and Edmund, I think, would have said the same. The point of those men is that any one of them standing that still is all of them. The honor isn't in the face, it's in the post. At the end of the service, as the coffin was carried out with Edmund's 4 medals pinned to the cushion on top of it, pinned this time, by hands that worked, the guardsman at the back of the chapel came to attention and brought his white-gloved hand up off his side, slow and exact, to the brim of the bearskin, and held the salute while the old soldier went past him and out the doors and into the light. He held it to the last, eyes front he never broke. And I thought of the cold morning at the foot of the Thornmere steps, and of an old man pushing himself up onto legs that hadn't held him in 2 years because a line of young men he'd never met had decided, without a word, that he would not stand alone. And I understood, finally and completely, the thing Edmund had been trying to tell me all along, in the back of that crowd before any of it, that he had been meant to be there, that he had always been meant to be at the front, that the only mistake the morning ever made was a steward's and a rope's, and that the men in red had quietly spent their stillness correcting it, because that, in the end, is what the stillness is for. The front row place was always his. It only took a man who could not move a muscle to give it back to him.